Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the panel room for our discussion of poisons and toxicology for writers. I'm your host, Nancy Northcott, and I'll start by asking the panelists to introduce themselves, tell us a little about themselves and about their interests in this topic. Misty, will you start?
Sure. I am Misty Massey. I am a novelist. I am the author of the Mad Kestrel series of pirate fantasy adventures, the latest of which just came out this spring, Kestrel's Dance. So, go and find that if you haven't already read it. I am also an editor for Lore Seekers Press, Falstaff Books, and Mocha Memoirs Press. And when I'm not writing, I play the character, the cleric, who is basically a beach girl. Her name is Malibu, and she is one of the cast of the Calamity Janes, which is the sister podcast to Authors and Dragons. It's actual play D&D, but done with the most fun in mind. So give us a listen sometimes. And I'm here because as an editor, I need to know a lot of things. I need to know a lot of things, or I need to be able to look up a lot of things if I don't already know. And so one of the things that's important to know about is toxicology and poisons. And I honestly, I just find it fascinating, the whole thing. So.
Okay, AJ.
I'm AJ Sherwood. I write. It's actually easier for me to list what I don't write, honestly, genre-wise. I don't write horror, I don't write suspense. How about that? I'm best known basically for my Ross series, Tribulations of a Supernatural PA. And now for my Fantasy Crack series, which is based off of my D&D campaign that I host in my house.
I want to play.
Yeah, by all means, you're welcome to. I call it villainy because the title's insane. But it's interesting that I'm actually in this panel because my Sherwood fans don't know any books at this point that I have put poisons into, but I've had to research them because I have 2 books that I have now finished that are coming out this year. So they will get educated eventually.
Okay. Well, we often think of poisons in conjunction with mysteries, where one person dies and then maybe another person dies and maybe another person dies. And the detective has to figure out what the poison is and obviously who did it and what to do about it. But poisons and toxic substances come up in all sorts of other situations. Let's talk about those for a minute. Anybody want to toss one out?
I mean, speaking as more or less a fantasy author, because that's typically what I write, I have a ton of different things that I've had to either research or make up that were basically on the level of toxicology, especially the Scales and Spells series. At one point, I'm going to actually screenshot this thing and share it with people so they can see. We had an Excel spreadsheet, okay? Multiple tabs, where all it was a list of all the ingredients, how powerful it was, whether it was benign or malignant, and what it could and could not mix with. And whenever we created any kind of a spell for that series, that was what we referenced. But there were specific things on there that were poisonous. And if you got too high of a ratio or whatever, it could be poisonous. So it's something you have to keep in mind when you're creating poisons. If you're in that kind of circumstance, you have to have pros, the cons, the treatment, what does this work with? What does it not work with? What nullifies it? What amplifies it? I had one plant where if you harvested it in the rain, it was immediately poisonous. You breathed in the fumes, you went down, bam. So people knew you did this on a dry day. And you did not put it anywhere near water unless you had some kind of a mask on you. Things like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think one of the things that's always bothered me is how Hollywood loves to make all poisons instant. Yeah. Most poisons, you don't know you've been poisoned for a long time unless somebody tells you you've been poisoned. And so that's why it's so dangerous, is because you end up, you ingest this, or you it touches your skin and soaks in, whatever kind of poison it is, and you don't know for a long time until you start feeling the effects, which we are in bodies have functions that are fairly finite, and so it has to function a certain way, and the poison is not going to kick in 3 seconds after it's not like Romeo and Juliet where you go, oh, that's with a kiss I die. It's just, that's not how most poison work. The vast majority of poison works. And so I like to look at these things, because I think Hollywood does such a disservice as far as reality. And I understand why they're going for the drama factor, but at the same time, there's no reason. There are movies that, I've brought up a couple that I figured we'd talk about later, that in both cases, the poison didn't get noticed until too late because they actually did it right. So,
Yeah, there is, I know this is like off the topic of books, but it's how my brain works. There's actually 2 different Asian dramas that I can think of where they did it right. One of them was Chinese, one of them was Korean. And in the Korean one, he'd been poisoned for like 3 years. Like, it was a steadily dose that they were doing.
Yeah.
And he finally figured out that they were, poisoning him. And he looked at the maid who was giving the poison and said, "Bring the rest. Let's finish this."
As a history person, I'm interested in environmental hazards. Like, there used to be arsenic in wallpaper. And at one point, people thought Napoleon had been poisoned with arsenic, as Misty was saying, a little bit at a time over a long period of time. And then other people are saying, well, not so fast, because there was arsenic in the wallpaper in the house where he lived. And people in the Renaissance and the early modern period, it was fashionable to slather white gunk all over your face. And that gunk had lead in it. So you're putting lead all over your face all day. And nobody knew the difference or what to do about it.
Well, and was it the Victorian period where they were using belladonna drops to make their eyes really, the eyes really wide, because that was considered beautiful, except it was also killing them. So
that too, and they were using arsenic powder, like a very light version of it, to clear their skin before any kind of major event. It got rid of acne, according to them. Well,
and it was also in green dye that they wore the clothes made out of too, and it became a contact poison, but a slow one again. So.
Well, and that's another thing that turns up sometimes in historical mysteries. I haven't seen it so much in more contemporary ones, which is poison in the clothes. And so you wear the clothes, and gradually over time the exposure builds up and it proves to be fatal.
Yep.
When I was getting ready for this panel, I found a couple of folk remedies for poison. Apparently, powdered emerald, which Lord knows everyone has lying around the house, is a universal detector for poison. And powdered unicorn horn, another common household item, is a universal cure. And have you all run across anything like that in your reading or your writing or your viewing?
I've run across some pretty weird ones. I think the one that was kind of the craziest to me was there's a little tome of folk remedies, and they all had timers on them to where they would actually say somewhere in the recipe, stop and do a Hail Mary, because everybody knew the rhythm and the cadence of it. And so it was a timekeeper. This took 4 minutes to do. And so sometimes you're like, this takes 8 Hail Marys. And so that's what you were intended to do while you're stirring, whatever it is you're making. And I was sitting there listening to this going, what?
That's pretty cool.
It was pretty cool history.
Yeah.
Something you don't normally encounter. And it was just this random tidbit I discovered in this volume for the 14th century.
And more specific than that standard remedy of a dash of something. Because it does, take a certain period of time. But there's that old saying, poison is a woman's weapon, which certainly in the things that I've read and seen, that's not accurate. But how do you all think that came about?
I think because women generally don't go for the more of physical kinds of murders. You know, we don't go running at somebody with a big stick and beat them in the head, just because generally whoever we're after is bigger and tougher than we are and can take the weapon away. So we're going to go, and you know, also there's a bit of an old wives' tale, I guess, about women being sneakier. And so poison is a sneaky weapon. So I could see where the folklore would say, women are deceitful and evil and sneaky. So of course they are going to poison your food instead of hitting you with a sword.
Well, I mean, speaking historically, there's two different things I can add to this because of the random rabbit holes that I fall down. One of them was I was researching cases from the 1920, 1940 eras, you know, that kind of span. And there was a interesting case where a woman who had murdered 2 husbands and was in the process of murdering her third was finally caught because she left so much evidence around the house of what she was doing that the police could not ignore it. And it was only at that point that they finally admitted that, oh, it probably was her that killed the first 2 husbands. It wasn't just an accident. She was 55 years old at this point, and they finally caught her. And it was just because of the culture of the time. They did not think a woman was capable of that kind of violence. Why they think that, I don't know. I mean, we deal with blood on a monthly basis, but okay, whatever. So there's that kind of attitude that you're dealing with. There's also, I forget her name. She was an Italian woman back in, I want to say, the 15th century, where she was dealing poisons to the women who would come to her for help because they had abusive husbands. And she was known as the Madam of Poisons. And it could well be that she's part of the reason why, you know, they think, oh, you know, poison is a woman's trade, because she was good at it. You know, she helped people for decades before they finally caught up with her.
Right. I just recently read a novel. It was a novelization. It did not take place in Italy. It took place in, I'm pretty sure, London, but it was about a woman who had, she had built a business. She, on the front side of the business, she was just an apothecary. But if you were a woman in trouble, you could come to her and she would make something to help you out, make something poisonous to help you out. And she went on for years doing this job, and everything was hunky-dory, and she was helping women, and the secret was being kept until this young woman decided she wanted to learn the trade, and she walks in and the whole book goes after that. But it was really good.
Yeah, I believe her front was that she made makeup.
Okay.
Business. That was her
cool.
cover.
That's cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to think of wearing what they used to think was makeup, because so often it was so heavy, not to mention stuff in it.
Mm-hmm.
So when you all set out to create a toxin or a poison or some kind of mind-altering substance, if we want to go down that road, AJ's already talked a little bit about her process, but how do you go about creating something for a specific thing? Misty, do you want to start?
Well, I actually haven't used poison in a story yet, or toxins like that in a story yet. I am considering it for the 3rd Kestrel book, so that might be something fun. But I think probably what I would do, not being a chemist or a toxicologist, I have to be careful, because I can't just go, oh, here's my poison and it works like this, and just assume that it's okay. Because even when I'm writing in a fantasy universe, things still have to follow certain natural laws so that the book makes sense, and so that the reader can understand what I'm even trying to put out there. Otherwise, it just kind of goes off the rails and the reader stops reading, and that's the last thing I want. So I have a book, and it's called Deadly Doses. Sorry if it turns out backwards. I'm not sure if it goes right or not. Is it right? Okay, good. It's called Deadly Doses, and it was written back in the 80s, I think. So I'm sure that a lot of the information has been updated since. But this is a really fabulous reference book to if you want to understand the basics of how toxins work and what kinds of toxins there are. And it covers everything from household toxins to industrial to plants to medical poisons and all kinds of things. So it's a really good book, and it's by Sarita Stevens. So, but I would look in here and probably hunt for what I wanted the toxin to do and then base it on something real. So that'd be my plan anyway.
AJ, do you want to add anything to what you said earlier?
I mean, it's funny. I actually have the updated version of that book. And that's what I reference. So yeah, I mean, most of it is just research. You're just looking for something that will either fit or not fit. A lot of the times, what poisons I do use is something based off of a real life case that I've studied. So it just fits, and I can just kind of roll with it. That said, I do have experts as beta readers who help me make sure that I keep all the science and the chemical stuff straight, because this girl knows nothing. And, you know, I've got at least one person who is a pathologist. That's her actual job. So there are times where I just email her going, so can I do this? Or does this not make sense? And there's been a couple of times where she comes back going, are you trying to kill them in a unique way? Or are you trying to make this solvable? And I'm like, yes. Work with me on this. How can I do this? I have very, very interesting email chains sometimes with people.
The only toxic thing I've used is in my Light Mage War series, the bad guys are the ghouls, and they have a venom in their blood that can be fatal in high enough doses. So in the book, that's the big one over my shoulder by itself, there's a new kind of ghoul venom, and they're trying to figure out what it is and how it's killing people, because the mages know about it, but the mundane people don't. And so this mundane woman has been murdered, and there's this toxin, and the doctor's trying to get enough sample to figure out what it is and explain it to the mundanes in a way that they will believe it, and yet not say, well, it's these magic people. But I was very vague about it because, like you say, I'm not a chemistry person, and I was afraid of writing myself into a corner with something I made up that might work for this book and oops, might not work 3 or 4 books down the road. And that would be a problem. So I do think being a little bit vague can work if the poison is not the centerpiece of your story. I mean, Misty, you're an editor. I would think that if it's the centerpiece of the story, you need to do whatever digging you need to do to make it detailed and accurate.
Yeah, it all depends on like you said, on how you're writing the story. And there are a lot of times my son and I this past year started watching the the Agatha Christie's Poirot shows with David Suchet. Mm-hmm. I had no idea. Why did nobody tell me years ago? But anyway, I digress. So we've been watching those, but the first 3 or 4 seasons, everything was strychnine. Everybody was being killed with strychnine, and we got tickled because sometimes the way that the strychnine behaved was not how strychnine behaves. And because I've read a little, I knew just enough to go, wait a minute, that's not quite right. But it's just how the story needed to go for Christie. So, I mean, she did a good job. She tried very hard to be accurate, but sometimes she kind of slid past and hoped that her readers wouldn't pay too much attention. So, and that's okay. As long as your story is going to make sense, then I can go with vague. Vague is cool.
I can assure you that it was the drama adaptation that screwed up and not her.
Okay.
Because Agatha Christie was a war nurse. She knew poisons very well.
Sure.
And there are times actually in the books that she describes poisons and their effects so well that nurses in the field would recognize the symptoms based upon her descriptions.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, so it was TV Land that screwed up. It was not her.
I absolutely believe that.
Well, when I was getting ready for the panel this afternoon, I was poking around on the internet, And I discovered a couple of books by a woman named Deborah Blum, Blum, that are, one of them is about corrupted food and the fight for regulations like, oh, you can't put formaldehyde in baby milk because babies are being poisoned by the milk. Right. And salicylic acid and borax used to preserve meat. Well, borax is a chemical cleaner. So it was, one of the books is about that, and the other one was about a case that was, I think, in the 1920s that helped sort of get toxicology more accepted in courtrooms as a form of evidence. It looked like a really interesting book, but AJ mentioned rabbit holes earlier, and I thought, yeah, that could be a great rabbit hole. I've got to move on from that. So what are some books or movies you've seen that you think use their toxins or poisons effectively?
Well, there's the two dramas that I mentioned. The Korean one was Goblin, which everybody loved it if you've ever watched the Korean one. The Chinese one was, I want to say it was called Oh My General or something like that. General Nye, that was it. And it was also very accurate in some ways because she actually poisoned the robe that he was supposed to put on for a wedding. And then hid her fingers because, of course, it stained the fingertips, and managed to get through several days with no one noticing the fingertips up until she goes into the wedding ceremony with him. And he's the one who notices and is like, oh shit. And manages to grab, like, doctors and everything. He's like, treat her first. Because, of course, he's had like a 20-second exposure to this. She's had days.
Right.
So I always thought that was interesting that they actually had managed to keep that accurate. There was something else that I was recently looking at that was interesting. It was a post that a friend had made. Did you know that potatoes can be poisonous?
Oh, yeah.
This is news to me.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. If they have those green sprouts coming off of them, you throw it away. You don't cut those off and use it.
Yep. When my son was away in college, I chose that time to read a book called Into the Wild, which is about a young man who, from a privileged background, who decided that he didn't want to go to college. He just wanted to go and see the country and live off the land and be free, and how young people kind of get crazy and do. And he ended up dying because he was eating. He had a book that told him what wild plants he could eat, and he thought he had identified correctly, but he was actually eating the potato pods, and ended up dying from it. And it was very, very sad. And so, of course, I'm reading this when my son is away at college, and so I'm crying at the end. And at the end, they take the mother to where he died, and she smells his pillow and said, "It still smells like him." And I'm going in my son's room, going, "Yes, it smells like him." So it was horrible. Don't read this book when your kids are away. But yeah, he ended up dying of poisoning by the potato sprouts and things. So.
I read an advice column letter a couple of weeks ago. This guy has a regular camping trip thing with some buddies of his, and they take turns doing the cooking. And he is a botanist. And so they had dinner, spaghetti sauce with mushrooms. And the people said, we picked the mushrooms outside. And he's like, "You did what?" And now they've already eaten it. And so it turned out nobody got sick, nobody died, but his friends did not seem to grasp that this had been really a stupid and dangerous thing to do. So his question for the columnist was, should I still be friends with these people? It's kind of like, well, I wouldn't eat with them, that's for sure. But it's sort of surprising. I guess you could use it as a plot device of somebody who just ignorantly blunders, like the guy with the potato sprouts.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a movie called The Beguiled that came out in 1971. I think they recently remade it, but I haven't seen that one. But the original was made in 1971, starred Clint Eastwood, and he played a Union soldier who it's right after the war. I mean, people are still going home from fighting, and he runs into this group of women who are living in an old schoolhouse, and he kind of decides he's just going to help himself to the women and their food and everything. And at the end, he's made everybody so jealous and angry with him that one of them finally picks a bunch of poisonous mushrooms and cooks them up. She tells everybody else that they're poisonous and not to eat them, but he's sitting at the dinner table and nom 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 nom, and he's loving. Oh, these mushrooms are so good. And after a little while, he realizes that he's been poisoned. That nobody's eating the mushrooms, and there's something wrong with them. But by then, it's too late, and he starts feeling the effects slowly, and he ends up dying. And it's a really interesting movie because, for one thing, in the 70s, you did not kill off your main character. And you also didn't make Clint Eastwood the bad guy. And he was totally the bad guy through this thing. But it was always interesting to me that was how they did him in, was feeding him the mushrooms that they picked. They purposely picked the poisonous ones. So,
yeah, a Miss Fisher's mystery. She used mushrooms to kill a grandmother that was very controlling and not a nice person. Yeah.
I love Miss Fisher.
I'm sorry, what?
I said I love Miss Fisher.
He's awesome.
Yeah.
In one of the J.D. Robb books, if you've read any of those, Eve Dallas and her partner Peabody go around, they talk to various people who have information about the case, as detectives would in a murder investigation. And this was just like a throwaway walk-on, walk-off character. It was an elderly woman who liked to bake things for the neighbors, and her husband was always eating what she baked. Mm-hmm. And so she baked a pie with poison in it and told him she specifically told him not to eat it. And guess what? And then they find out about that. AJ, you're nodding, and I don't remember whether Eve arrested that woman or not. Do you?
He does.
Yeah.
I want to say it was like book 1 or 2. Like, it was fairly early on in the series.
Well, there's like 40 of them. So when I thought about trying to sit down this afternoon and figure out what it's like, yeah, you got other things to do today than that, because it just goes on. But it was an interesting little bit because it's really just a throwaway character. It's just somebody with information about the case. And then there's this little poison blip on the radar screen of the overall murder investigation.
Yeah, I actually appreciated that, just because, I mean, in real life, a detective is not working on one case at a time. Like, there's just no way. They're constantly juggling multiple cases. So it was a nice touch to me that she had another case intertwined with the main case that she was working on in the book. Like, a little touch of realism in that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool.
So before we move on, is there anything else that you all want to mention as an effective use of this kind of, because what I'm kind of going for is, if people are interested in doing this in a story, what should they read? What movies or TV shows should they watch? Assuming they can find them, because not even with streaming, not everything is always available.
That's true. Although I can highly recommend going to your local library. Lots and lots of things are on DVD in collections. And if they don't have it in the library, you can ask for interlibrary loan, and they will be delighted to help you. Go to the library.
Yeah, the library is always a good reference. And, it's gotten to the point now where I just kind of throw things at Google just to see if anything will stick. And then that's when I actually call my experts and go, tell me about this. And that kind of helps narrow things as well. I mean, if you don't have experts, because I have to do this all the time, I just get on Facebook and go, hey, who knows something about whatever? And that helps too, because people love to correct you if you're wrong. It's a very good method.
And sometimes they like to correct you if you're right.
That too.
Yeah, that too. So there are a lot of different ways to detect poisons, depending on what kind of a poison it is. So what have you seen done effectively? And if you were going to do this yourself, how would you go about figuring this out?
I mean, if you go according to the Victorian method of detecting if something's wrong, then people are pale and wasted looking, and they kind of just drape themselves across lounges like corpses. And that's supposed to be the telltale sign.
Hard to tell, though, because they did that a lot anyway in the Victorian era.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say, I kind of am, then I'm poisoned all the time because I'm often draping myself across the couch, but
not pale and wan and kind of.
No, I'm generally only pale from like late December to about early February, and then I can go outside and I get warm again. So, but
I mean, really, poisons have different effects on the body, so it kind of depends on what you're looking at.
Yeah, I was gonna say the same thing. I find it very interesting that just a general toxicology test that labs will run only hits a few things. And if you've been poisoned by something that is not in the standard lineup of what those tests are looking for, they could miss it entirely. And so that's something that I think would be useful in a story. If I'm setting the story in modern day, of course, I would want to use a toxin or a poison that did not appear on those tests, so that I could buy myself time to maybe get away with it. Although then again, using something exotic does then limit who can get their hands on it. So, I would have to be careful of how the person using the poison got their hands on it in the first place, so that they weren't just the only suspect immediately.
Right.
But,
I mean, there's all that to factor in. And I did see, what was that thing called? Sword Art Online had a specific book where the main character was attacked with a poison. And the other heroine of the story was actually praised by the hospital staff because she grabbed the needle that he was attacked with and brought it with her to the hospital so they could actually test the needle directly. And they're like, you saved his life by doing that, because otherwise it's just shot in the dark. We're just testing for everything. And some of these tests, I mean, that's the other thing that Hollywood always gives you a misconception on. These tests can sometimes take weeks before you get results.
Yep.
And if this is a fast-acting poison, you're screwed. Like, there's no coming back from that. So that's kind of something to take into account too, is how fast you can get results. And a lot of labs are really backed up. Like, it sometimes takes months to get results back.
Oh yeah.
Even if it's an emergency situation.
Well, in my poking around on the internet this afternoon, I ran across an article that most of it is behind a paywall, of course, but there is a preview of it, the first couple of pages, that talks about several different methods of looking for foreign substances, not just poison and toxins, but all that kind of comes under the heading of toxicology, stuff that should not be in your system. And it explained things like distillation. It did not explain what chromatography is, which I would have liked to have known. I'm sure if I'd gone and looked that up somewhere else, I would have found it. And if I were going to write something and use that, I would have. But I was just looking for different methods. And they talk about how to separate substances. So I think if people look around and are just a little bit persistent, they can find things like that without having to worry about the paywall.
Sure.
I have a doctor friend who helps me some with the medicine in the Light Mages series, because the hero, I think I said earlier, is a doctor. And he used a flow cytometer to analyze blood, and that looks for particles in the blood. And so he adapted it magically. And so I wonder if you all have seen like a magic adaptation of technology or a magical method that seemed to you to work really well that you would share with people.
I mean, I've adapted technology. Does that count?
Yeah, please.
We actually had to do that quite a bit in the Skeleton Spell series, because what we needed to do was either almost technology available or it was like cutting edge. So we had to kind of do a magical advancement of it for it to work. Mostly in the line of explosives. I have to admit that. The boys like to explode things. Especially if you're writing anything like steampunk level. You're constantly having to adapt technology over with magic because it's that kind of a setting. So there's that as well. What also is curious to me is why people choose poisons. Because if you think about it, there's other easier methods that are not detectable. You know, needle of air into anybody's body will give them a heart attack.
Yeah, but that requires a closeness. You know, you have to get right up on somebody and stick a needle in them, where I can put poison in the dinner. And no, I didn't poison us. So my family across the room. You know, you can put poison in the dinner and then walk away. And if they eat it, well, then they're poisoned and your job is done and off I go to wash the dishes. But I don't have to actually be in physical contact. So, you know, there's a distance, and I think that might be it. Or a reason anyway.
Yeah, you do have to kind of look at the psychology of the character into this as well. You know, what they're comfortable doing, what they're not comfortable doing, that kind of thing.
Right.
We know in one of the Christian Bale Batman movies, Scarecrow was the villain, and he had put a toxin into the Gotham water supply that was making everybody paranoid and delusional and afraid of everything. And Batman just solved it by methods that were not shared with us in about 20 minutes of screen time. And he gave the heroine, played by Katie Holmes, the antidote, and then delivered enough for Gotham City, which, I mean, I don't know enough to know how big a truckload of this stuff you would need to poison a reservoir that serves an entire city. I don't remember there being a truckload of either the poison or the antidote, but maybe. I don't know.
That seems like a plot hole big enough to drive a Mack truck through. But okay.
You're supposed to be more concerned about Batman and the assistant district attorney than.
Oh, okay.
Well, you know, there's another movie that I'm real fond of. It's called DOA. It came out in 1988, and I'm going to spoil it. So if you haven't seen it, sorry, but it's been out since 1988. What have you been doing? Anyway, the main character is a literature professor at some school and some university, and he starts feeling really rough and he doesn't know why, and so he goes to the doctor, and apparently a couple of days before, as far as they can tell, and again it's the magic Hollywood labs that were doing this, but they figure out that he's been poisoned with a radioactive substance and they can't help him. He's going to die. And so he sets out to solve his own murder. And it turns out to be the fault of another professor who read a graduate student's novel, which was his thesis project, was this novel. And the other professor read it and was so impressed and decided then and there that his failing writing career was going to be ramped up by him stealing this manuscript and killing off the student that wrote it. And he managed that, but then he realized that he needed to get rid of anybody who'd ever read the manuscript, i.e. the professor it was turned into, who, being kind of a jerk, had not actually read the manuscript himself in the first place. It had just been sitting on his desk and he hadn't even looked at it. So he honestly died for no reason, but he ends up solving his own murder. But it's always so funny to me that this man, the two people were murdered, one horribly by being given a radioactive substance, and it was all for a novel and for a writing career.
If only we were able to produce stuff like that. Yeah,
right.
You are reminding me though of an older movie. I don't even know what time zone this is. It was a black and white one.
It's probably the original DOA. Yeah, 1950 or so.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah,
that's probably what it was from. I have no recollection whatsoever of the entire movie. I just remember the ending scene where the cop looks at the other cop going, how do we report? He's like, just mark him DOA. Because he's dead on arrival.
Well,
Yeah,
and a couple of Russian expatriates murdered with radiation in the United Kingdom.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That happens a lot when they're not, mysteriously falling out of third floor windows. They're being stuck with radioactive substance, and they find out they're sick a whole lot later when it's too late to help. So I don't remember what the substance was. Polonium. Thank you.
Sounds right.
I have magic person across the room telling me these things, but yeah, it was polonium.
Well, and Alexei Navalny had something like that, and he was treated and recovered so he could go to prison. But I don't remember what that was either. But he did get over it, which was, a good thing. So, when you're reading a story that involves poisons or toxicology, or you're watching a TV show or a movie, what pulls you out of it?
Plot holes.
Just a plot hole, or a plot hole having to do with the poison, or just really any plot hole?
I mean, really any plot hole. But if it's such a glaringly obvious issue where they're not really trying to keep the biology and the science straight, then at that point I'm like, okay, I don't know who did research on this. Clearly no one. But yeah, that kind of just jars me out of the story. I mean, half of the reason why stories work is because you're trying to get the reader or the viewer in with a certain amount of suspension of disbelief. And if you can get them to that level and then stay consistent with whatever logic you've put together, they're fine, because they're not going to be jarred back out of it. But it's when you start jarring them back in and out, that's when you've basically lost them, because they get frustrated. They can't stay in that world. So,
yeah, I agree. I mentioned Romeo and Juliet before, where he swallows the poison and immediately dies. He has time enough for a couple of lines and he's gone. And so that is so unusual, because very few poisons act quickly enough for you to drink them and then be dead within seconds. And you're certainly not going to be pretty dead. If they're going to be that effective and kill you that quickly, it's going to be icky, because you're going to throw up, or you're going to bleed, or something horrible is going to happen. You're not just going to go, so that kind of thing, when it's not Romeo and Juliet, I give Shakespeare a pass, because he was writing at a time when they didn't know any better. But nowadays, if it's a modern thing, and the poison instantly kills with absolutely nothing to make it clear what happened, I immediately go, wait, what? I don't know. So,
yeah, it reminds me of The Inspector Calls. It was originally a stage play, became a movie, but they actually show where the poor girl poisoned herself because she was committing suicide. But that took hours for her to die. I think it was like a 3.5 hours time span. Mm-hmm. And I mean, she had doctors and nurses and everything trying to help her, but she had literally burned her own esophagus out. So she was dead at that point. But that was realistic. Like, that's kind of what poisons do. They're literally tearing apart your system.
I was listening to a podcast a couple of summers ago when, and it was about, I can't remember the name of it, but it was about a man in this little town in Mississippi, and just he knew more than was safe for him to know, and about some murder or something that had happened there. And eventually he was talking to a reporter on the phone, and he decided he was going to kill himself. And so he went and he drank some caustic substance that was in his kitchen, some cleaner, and he drank it and then immediately started shrieking. This was true life. And so he immediately started shrieking, and the reporter said it was the most horrible thing he'd ever heard. And it was because this stuff was eating the skin and was killing him by destroying his tissues. And so yeah, that's not a good way to go at all. So do not drink the bleach. Do not drink the Drano or anything like that. Don't drink that stuff.
Yeah, don't put borax in your meat.
Don't put borax in your meat.
Yeah. So if you were going to advise writers who are setting out to write a story where this is a central point, not just something that happens incidentally along the way, how would each of you advise them to start that project?
There's a couple of things you're going to have to decide from the start before you even get into the mystery itself. You need to figure out how complex you want the mystery to be. Is this like a side mystery where you've got mostly romance? Is it the reverse? Because if you're trying to make it a complex case, that's kind of going to tell you which kind of poison to use, because it can't be something that's going to be automatically found. Like, this has got to be something that's unusual or something that's hard to test for, or something they just don't think to test for unless there's some kind of other indication. So that's kind of step one, is how complex is the mystery going to be? Your second decision is going to be, how much research do you want to do? Because that's going to be a major factor. You're either going to have to find an expert who can walk you through this, or you're going to have to pick up a book and really research this in order to figure it out. I mean, the How Done It series is really helpful for this, because they not only have the Book of Poisons, but they also have Body Trauma book.
I've got that one.
Yeah, every editor I ever know has had the Body Trauma book. It's a lifesaver.
It really is.
It really is. It's very helpful. And it will actually detail to you, this is the symptoms that they're going to display. This is the kind of recovery time that you're looking at. This is how you treat it. And this is how debilitating it is. Like, you're going to either be down for a week or down for 6 months, depending.
Yep.
So Body Trauma book for the win. But that's kind
Absolutely.
of the first two things that you're going to have to really look at. And then you can kind of figure out, okay, well, what's available poison-wise in the scope of what I'm trying to do.
Misty, did you want to add anything?
No, I think AJ's kind of covered it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything else that you all would like to talk about that we haven't discussed yet?
The only other thing that I want to add on to this is, do keep in mind, most criminals are really stupid. So if you're writing a mystery, you need to throw in something that they've done, unless you're just wanting a good cat and mouse game, which I'm always appreciative of. But I've been talking to several different detectives, or people who are actually working in a criminal field, and they tell me, you would not believe the stupidity of what these guys do. Like, apparently it's common for a murderer to either pee or poop in the room with the victim before they leave.
Why?
I don't understand this. I guess they're just marking territory or whatever.
Ew.
I don't get it. But of course,
We don't watch TV and crime scene dramas.
Yeah. I mean, it's a clear indication of who was there, because it's still DNA.
Yeah, big old pile of DNA. Good gracious.
Yeah, apparently that's an issue. Something else that they kind of always tell me, going, is blood is almost impossible to get out of things. Like, even if you try to paint over stuff, even if you give like 3 coats of paint over something, it's still luminescent. They can still pick it up. And it's there for years. Like, blood is really hard to get out of stuff. So if you have a poison that's going to make somebody throw up blood, that's something to factor in, is that blood's going to be really, really, really hard to get out of. There was a case where the guy had killed a friend in a fit of rage, and then walked back to his house and stripped all of his clothes off and threw it into the washing machine. Well, in the process, he touched the washing machine, of course, got blood on it. So he wiped it clean. And even on
The
a
rag.
surface like that, Well, it was still, the blood prints were still on the washing machine itself. You can't wipe it clean. He thought he had, but of course, yeah. So that's kind of a factor to put in. Like, there's a lot of evidence too that they love to put into Ziploc baggies and like clear baggies on TV. I've been told not to do that because that will encourage evidence to actually grow like mold and will slowly destroy itself. So you actually put that into paper envelopes, which is news to me. Yeah. So it really helps if you're going to be writing a mystery and the poison is going to be like the central factor. Find a cop and start asking questions, because there's a lot that Hollywood either doesn't get right or they don't even show the process.
Right.
I mean, usually, actually, this is news to me too. The first people on scene for any kind of a case is not the police, it's the firemen.
Yeah.
I learned that one recently. So,
A friend of mine's first book was about arson, and she called her local fire department and basically asked questions about arson and accelerants. And they said, we'll get back to you. And so she's pretty sure they checked out her website to be sure that they were not coaching a budding criminal in how to do this, and about what the remains of someone who dies in a fire and not just from smoke inhalation look like. And she just called the public affairs number for the fire department. And I would imagine it couldn't hurt to try that with the police department. There's no guarantee that they'll go, oh, sure, we'll put an officer on the line, but you could try it and they might be able to point you somewhere.
What I discovered, because they actually have a class taught by a police academy, it's called MurderCon. And it's the beginning of the year, usually, is when they offer the classes, somewhere around February. I did MurderCon one year. It was fascinating. I have not taken notes that furiously since I left college. Talk about good information. But one of the things that every single teacher I had, which is an active cop, they all said the same thing. We really enjoy helping the writers get their facts straight, because the more that you can put good information into the minds of the public, the less work we have. Because people have different conceptions of how fast a case can be worked because of Hollywood, which is not accurate. I mean, sometimes these cases take years before they're resolved. The law is not fast.
Nope.
They like to be, they want to be, they're just not. They have way too much cases to deal with. So if you do approach a policeman and say, hey, I'm writing a murder mystery, I want to actually get the procedure correct, they're probably going to help.
Yeah.
If they have the time, they're probably going to help.
Well, another resource is teachers, like at community colleges who teach crime scene procedures.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of them, here again, there's no such thing as a standard. You can't be sure the person you're going to approach is actually going to be helpful. But it never hurts to write a polite email and say, I'd like to do this. I'd be happy to send you a gift certificate to your favorite restaurant, buy you coffee, whatever, just to say, I know this is your stock in trade and I'm willing to pay something if you'll just answer some questions for me.
I'm always fascinated when I read stories and you get to the back, and I'm one of those that will read all the extra stuff, the acknowledgments and everything. And I'd love to get to the acknowledgments when somebody is thanking every professional that they had to talk to along the way. And they go, and I'm thanking this person for this and this person for that and this person for this. And it's all these people that they talk to in order to make their story plausible and make it work, so that you're not having to suspend every bit of your disbelief. You only have to suspend that certain amount that AJ was mentioning, and the rest of it's still taking place in the real world. So, yeah, there's quite a few professionals that you can reach out to. I mean, I actually sat down once with a prosecuting attorney for 2 hours. That was a fascinating conversation. Learned all sorts of different things from him. And he just sat down there for free. I mean, he was just talking to a college course going, okay, guys, here's what it's actually like to be a prosecuting attorney. Yeah. There's a lot of professionals you can reach out to. And if you're going to talk to medical people about icky things, take them to a coffee shop and do it in front of people, because it's fun to watch the reaction. Faith Hunter is a good friend of mine, and I was talking to her before Kestrel's Dance was published, because I needed to kill off a character, and I wanted to check if the way that I was choosing to kill the character was okay, would work, how it would work, how long they would be able to speak before death set in, after the injury, before death set in, and that kind of thing. And so we're sitting there talking about all the ways that the bad guy can kill this character. And I look around, and people at tables near us were just floored. They were because here are these two middle-aged ladies talking about blood gushing and arterial spray and and drinking coffee. So that's always fun.
All the fun stuff.
Oh yeah.
Well, if that's everything, then we'll wrap up here. And if you all would tell people where they can find you and information about your books, and if there's anything out recently or upcoming that you'd like to mention, please do that. AJ, will you start?
Sure. You can find me on Facebook a good majority of the time. That seems to be always up for me. My group is AJ Sherwood's Gentlemen. And you can also find information on my website, ajsherwood.com. I've got actually 2 releases coming out this week because I'm crazy. One of them is part 5 of Villainy. And we have the first Ice Dragons book, Ruins, that will also be out on Friday.
Awesome. And I'm Misty Massey. As I said, I'm the author of the Mad Kestrel series of pirate fantasy adventures. The latest book just came out in June. It's called Kestrel's Dance. But the first book, in case you haven't read it, is for sale on Amazon right now for 99 cents. You can't beat that. So go buy yourself a pirate adventure and see if you don't love it. If you want to hear me talk about other things besides just my books, you can find me, of course, on my webpage, mistymassey.com. You can find me on Facebook and Twitter for a minute anyway. And I have lately gotten into playing on the TikToks. So I make videos on TikTok now. Go find my videos, because there are pirate jokes, and I think I put a belly dance one on yesterday. We're going to see how that goes. So go find me on TikTok.
Okay. And you can find me here on ConTinual a lot. My website is nancynorthcott.com. At least for the time being. I'm in the habit of spending more time than is probably good for me on Twitter, where I'm at Nancy Northcott. I write historical fantasy for Falstaff Books. I also write space opera, and the books with shirtless guys are The Light Mage Wars, Contemporary Paranormal Romances, and just out is Embattled Mage, but really you should start with the first one. So thank you, AJ and Misty, for joining me for this discussion. And thank you to everyone who's watching. And remember, ConTinual is the convention that never sleeps.